Hello and welcome to another episode of GamerpiEce Theatre. I'm Kevin from Happy Beard Games, and this is a video series dedicated to video game history, learning some facts, learning some information, and learning all about these awesome arcade games. Today's focus is the game Rampart, released in 1990 by Atari for arcades. We're checking it out today on the SEGA Genesis port, as well as the original arcade port in the Midway Classics Arcade Collection #1 for the Nintendo GameCube. So let's check out this game Rampart today, a precursor to current-gen tower defense games and a strategy game in the arcades for up to 3 players. Rampart is an awesome game. Let's jump in with GamerpiEce Theatre, Rampart. Warlords and weaponry in ancient times. That's the setting of the video game Rampart, an arcade classic from Atari, released in 1990. And this game Rampart is a strategy game. Yes, it's a little bit different than most arcade games of the time that were shoot-em-ups or platformers. Around 1990, maybe even beat-em-ups. You know, the Nintendo NES had been out for 5 years at this point, and arcades were a little bit different than they were in the early 80s. Most of my past GamerpiEce videos have been about the earlier arcades in the 80s, but this is a 1990 game. And in this game, it kind of pushes the boundaries of video games by adding strategy. So what is Rampart, how is it played, and what does it have to do with tower defense games today? The game of Rampart can begin in 2 different ways. One way is single player, the other way is multiplayer. And in the arcades, not only could you play against a computer in Rampart, you could bring up to 2 buddies for 3-player action and all-out war in the battleground of Rampart. And in the multiplayer modes, there's a river dividing each player's fortress and their territories in the gameplay. However, on the 1-player mode, you're on the coastline of a continent, and you defend your country and territory from ships that come in through the ocean. Single player and multiplayer are a little bit different on each layout, and I find multiplayer to be much more fun and engaging with friends. In the game Rampart, you take control of a warlord, defending and attacking from your base onto the opponent's fortifications by using your own cannons and catapults, and building your own defenses as you battle in an all-out war against 1 or 2 enemy players. The gameplay consists of turn-based action. You take your turn, your opponent takes their turn, go back and forth until the battle is won, and the game is over. In the mode that I played, you started out with 3 cannons, so you place your cannons anywhere within your territory within the fortification of your walls. Keep in mind that you cannot place cannons outside your walls of the fortress, and that is indicated by the tile turning blue because you're the blue army. Each of the turns consists of having a time limit, which is indicated on the screen. Once the time limit's over, your turn is up, and then you move on to the attack phase. During the attack phase, you and your opponents are attacking at the same time in a shooter mode. The ships can additionally send out troops once they reach the beach, and the troops can march over to your towers and destroy them. You can only shoot a limited amount of shots with your cannons, and the more cannons you have, the more shots you have available during the attack phase. There will be more attack phases on the same level, so you have to keep that in mind to build more cannons later on. Once the attack round is complete, you will notice that you have to build and repair your towers, so everything that you took damage from on the previous attack round will actually do damage to your tower and your fortress. so you have to go and rebuild it. Now, the rebuilding phase was marketed as a Tetris-style rebuild phase. Even the developers talked about it being Tetris-style, and it's mentioned on the box that it's similar to Tetris in that you have different shapes, such as the falling blocks on Tetris. However, this is not a puzzle game like Tetris. You have randomly shaped blocks that change their shape depending on the next block and the next block that show up. You can connect these blocks together to make a wall around your fortress base. If you're really good, you can make your base even bigger than it was in the previous round. And if you're an even better Rampart player, you can try to capture another fortress during your gameplay to expand your territory even further. But keep a close eye on the time limit during this mode. If you do not fully complete your wall around your area of the fortress, then you will get a game over. You will have multiple continues, however, on the home console versions, and you might have to insert a quarter on the arcade versions. It's difficult because you have the pressure of the time limit counting down, as well as the randomized blocks and Tetris-style shapes that you have to build your wall around your fortress in order to complete it within a certain time limit. This can make the game quite challenging as you try to make a bigger base, or just try to fit in as much pieces as possible in a short amount of time, so that way you can actually get another turn in the gameplay. While you're awarded points for building a bigger base and capturing more territory during your turn, you also have to think about strategy during this short amount of time that you have to build. You have to think about the positioning of your fortress, you have to think about where to place the cannons. Can you fit enough cannons within those walls? Can you make enough walls to defend against all the shots that are coming at you during the next turn? And it's hard to think about all that strategy during this short amount of time in an arcade game. You have only 20 seconds to really consider and plan out your strategy for this game. It's a lot to process in a short amount of time, whereas tabletop games such as Warhammer or other strategy games might give you a lot more time in comparison. To complete a level, you have to successfully destroy all the oncoming ships and make sure they have no more reinforcements left over. Once you've destroyed all the ships as well as survived by building your fortress and keeping it intact, then you have completed that level, and you move on to the next level on another stage on the same continent map, which zooms into a different area, and you begin the game again. Of course, it's harder this time in typical arcade fashion. There'll be more ships, some different ship types, including ones with darker sails that last longer, and they will even send out more enemies on the beach to come and attack your fortress. In later stages, some of the walls will still be burning during the build phase, and you cannot build over those fire spots. So now that we know the basics of the gameplay of Rampart, you can see how it sort of bridges the gap between strategy games, arcade games, and later tower defense games. That's it for the basics of gameplay of Rampart. Let's move on to some history and facts about the game. And while you think of strategy games as something like a tabletop game like Warhammer or Dungeons & Dragons, Rampart took the strategy of war games and brought it to the arcades. They included a few short developer interviews on the Midway Arcade Treasures collection, and I'll share those with you here. The first one is about some of the developers and their ideas behind the game's design, about its Tetris-style building mechanics, and how it's different than other games of the time.
John and Dave started working on Ramparts after we did Clax, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so they were messing around with Tetris puzzle pieces, and in their typical style, they came up with a totally unique approach to this game, and something that definitely only they could come up with. I mean, the concept of taking these puzzle pieces and building a wall, and then having another stage where you go into this battle mode. I mean, it's so abstract and strange, but anyway, they got the game up and running in a very easy play, a fundamental state, and then Pete Lipson, who was another developer at the time, programmer, worked with Mike a lot, and I, at lunchtime, started playing Rampart every day at lunch.
Religiously.
And because you're building walls, we became known as the Wall Boys. And we were the first people, clearly, to play Ramparts. And I think a lot of our enthusiasm helped fuel them along, and we fed back to them on what was needed. But it was an amazingly, we all used to laugh with them about how bizarre the game design was. I mean, the whole puzzle piece, building walls, cannons, fighting stage, and it's a very unique game, very interesting game to me, how it works out. A lot of fun with the trackballs, and so we were with them during that whole time. It was a blast.
The second developer interview briefly touches on the trackball elements and origins of the trackball in arcade games. It's short and a little hard to understand because of the audio quality, but I'll have it here in its original form presented to you.
Correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Jerry Lychek here basically invent the trackball?
I think he was
Atari?
responsible for that, yeah.
Jerry, yeah.
A mechanical industrial engineer who was employed here for years and years and years. He's the guy, the brains behind the original trackball. I think he came up with the idea of using a cue ball as the mechanism.
Oh, the first one, it was much larger than the cue ball.
Was it?
And we even designed one, I think it's still hanging around, with a bowling ball.
And yes, this was a game in the arcades that used a trackball controller instead of a joystick controller. And of course at home on the GameCube you can use the GameCube controller or an arcade stick if you have one. The SEGA Genesis version also works well with the Genesis controller or any joystick controller for the Genesis. And the game actually does transition very well to a joystick. I prefer to use the D-pad for selecting those Tetris-style building blocks. And I think that might actually be easier than using the trackball. However, I think the trackball controller would be very helpful for the fast-paced ship-shooting combat. And about the controls, the game uses a trackball on the 3-player version of the arcade machine. There's also 2 buttons for each player, a fire, which allows you to shoot your cannons, and a rotate button which allows you to change the position of the Tetris-style pieces you use to build your fortress. There's also a 2-player version of the game released in 1991, a year later, which uses joysticks only. And both versions, the 3-player and 2-player, are presented in traditional upright arcade cabinets. You do have the option to speed up the cursor in these games, which does help as well on the home console version, the SEGA Genesis version included. The legacy of Rampart is that Rampart is considered a precursor to the very first tower defense genre games, which came out around a decade later. For those of you that don't know about tower defense games are a subgenre of strategy video game. The goal is to defend players' territories or possessions by obstructing enemy attackers, usually achieved by placing defensive structures on or along their path of attack. One of the first modern-style tower defense games in early years was Rampart, of course. There were also tower defense elements as mini-games in many other games in the early 90s. One of those games was Final Fantasy VI for the Super Nintendo, which had you placing mod characters in separate positions throughout a map to defend a character that needed protection. There was also the Fort Condor minigame in Final Fantasy VII in 1997 for the PlayStation. That Fort Condor minigame from Final Fantasy VII was one of the first tower defense games with 3D graphics. And while that was just one of the many minigames in Final Fantasy VII, it really did influence the tower defense genre as well. Since Rampart in 1990, there wasn't too many tower defense games all the way up until 2006 with Warcraft 3, which had a custom world editor and had some tower defense style maps in that game. The next years of 2007 and 2008 was when tower defense games really took off on the smartphone app stores. Some of these games had very simple titles such as Flash Element Tower Defense and Desktop Tower Defense. In 2009, one of the most popular tower defense games, and one of my favorites, is Plants vs. Zombies. And while strategy tower defense games have different layouts and gameplay mechanics, they do have a very similar style that connects them all together and leads them all the way back to Rampart. And if you want to bring it back even further to 1980, another game that I've covered on GamerpiEce Theatre in the past, Missile Command, is an inspiration for Rampart. Missile Command also features a trackball controller, some strategy involved, as well as defending your bases from an onslaught of missiles coming at you from above. You can check out my own video of Missile Command on GamerpiEce Theatre in a past episode. And Rampart was released on the SEGA Genesis 2 years later, in 1992, by Tengen. Tengen is a subsidiary of the company Atari, and was releasing many games on the NES, some of them quite controversially, such as Tetris, and many of them were unlicensed because of limitations by Nintendo's publishing and some other restrictions. But a little bit later, and on Sega would release officially licensed Tengen games for their console, the SEGA Genesis. So this was in 1992 when this game was released on the SEGA Genesis, versus the 1990 release on the arcades. For some reason, it's been surprisingly difficult to find some behind-the-scenes and developer information about the creation of the game Rampart. Aside from the fact that it's a tower defense, it has similarities to Tetris, and it uses a trackball, I couldn't find much more information about the behind-the-scenes of the video game development. Now, most of the gameplay footage we're seeing in this video is recorded from the Midway Arcade Treasures collection for the Nintendo GameCube. This is also released on the PS2 and the Xbox, as well as the PSP and on the Game Boy Advance version of the Midway Arcade Treasures, which was a smaller collection. It's also on other ports, but this is the most exact port that I know of for many of these arcade games. That's why I come back to this multiple times in GamerpiEce Theatre. And it has a very good port of Rampart once again. You can still play against up to 2 other players on this Midway Arcade Treasures port on the GameCube. And while there really isn't any recent remakes or ports of Rampart, there is some ports on earlier consoles such as the SEGA Genesis and the Super Nintendo. The SEGA Genesis version here features only up to 2-player multiplayer, and features slightly different graphics as well as a slightly different single-player experience. And that's it for today's GamerpiEce Theatre. We checked out the Atari arcade classic Rampart today, and if you like this video, please be sure to leave it a like. You can leave a comment and suggest a game from a classic arcade to have in a future GamerpiEce Theatre episode. Also, remember to subscribe to support Hybrid Games and share it with your friends. You can also check me out on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Alright everybody, thanks for watching GamerpiEce Theatre once again. Stay tuned for more. Bye! Warlords and weaponry in ancient times. That's the war boy. We got a game here, guy.